The night he gave up everything, no one was watching. No cameras, no audience, just one old man and a child clinging to life. Frank Delaney had worked the night shift at St. Augustine General for over 30 years. He wasn't the kind of man who sought attention. His routine was built on quiet footfalls, sharp eyes, and a gentle nod to the nurses passing in the dim corridors. The uniform didn't fit like it used to. His back curved slightly now, and his knees ached in the rain, but his heart had never aged. He had never married. No children. No real family left since his brother passed away 5 years earlier. His life was small, quiet, and often invisible. But Frank liked it that way. Until the winter of 1998, when everything changed. That December, the cold had teeth. Ice hugged the windows of the hospital like a silent warning. Frank had just finished his rounds on the south wing when he noticed something unusual. Room 412's light was still on. That room had been empty for 2 weeks. He tapped the door with his knuckle and pushed it open slightly. Inside, a small child was sleeping curled in the bed, for lines in her arm, an oxygen monitor beeping steadily. She couldn't have been older than 6. Her face was pale, framed by dark curls, and her cheeks flushed with fever. Thought this room was out of use, Frank mumbled to himself. A nurse appeared behind him, startled. "Oh, sorry, Mr. Delaney. That's Ella Martinez. They brought her in from county emergency. Acute leukemia. No family." Frank's brow furrowed. No family. A 6-year-old? Mom's in rehab. Dad's gone. CPS is working on placement, but nobody wants to take in a kid this sick. The nurse's voice softened. She doesn't talk much. Scared of everyone. But she asked me for toast earlier. That's something. Frank nodded, lingering in the doorway a second longer than he meant to. That night, instead of finishing his shift and going home to his old recliner and the faint buzz of the TV, Frank went back to room 412. He knocked gently. Ella stirred, eyes fluttering open. She looked at him, guarded. "I'm Frank," he said simply. "I keep watch here at night." The girl blinked. "You like stories?" he asked. A pause, then a nod. From then on, every night that week, Frank brought her stories. Some made up, some old ones from his childhood, and once even a tale about a brave raccoon that outsmarted a pack of wolves. Ella listened without saying much, but she started smiling. Just a little. By the second week, Frank was bringing her toast from the cafeteria. Buttered just right. By the third, he was sneaking in a stuffed bear he'd found at a thrift shop. He called it Captain Bristles. Captain Bristles, Ella whispered that night. It was the first time Frank had heard her speak. He smiled, so wide his wrinkles nearly folded in half. The hospital wasn't thrilled. Frank wasn't supposed to be spending time off duty with patients. They warned him once, then twice. But he kept going back. When Ella got worse, he started using his paycheck to buy her medication the hospital couldn't justify covering under emergency care. Her case wasn't prioritized for transplant. Too many patients ahead of her. Too few willing to foster a child with a prognosis as grim as hers. Frank started skipping meals to afford more. Skipping sleep. He even pawned the last watch his father gave him to pay for a specialized antibiotic. Then the letter came. "Mr. Delaney," the HR rep said, her voice clipped. "We're going to have to let you go." "Let me go?" he asked, stunned. "You've violated too many policies. Unauthorized access. Misuse of time. And we've received complaints from administration about your interference in medical protocol." His eyes burned, but he didn't raise his voice. "I was just trying to help." She gave a tight smile. "We appreciate your intentions, but rules are rules." Frank left the hospital that day with a cardboard box of belongings and no pension. He hadn't realized how much the job meant until it was gone. He didn't tell Ella. He just told her Captain Bristles had to go on a secret mission and left the bear by her bedside. Then he disappeared. For years, Frank lived on the edge of the city in a tiny rented room. He worked odd jobs: janitor at a mechanic shop, greeter at a hardware store, handing out samples at a supermarket. Enough to scrape by? Barely. He often thought about Ella. wondered if she survived, if someone eventually stepped in, if she remembered the stories or the toast. Sometimes he dreamed of her. In those dreams, she was always running, laughing, and holding that bear tight. Then came the letter. It arrived on a gray spring morning in 2023. Frank was 72, tired, and a little sick himself. His hands trembled as he opened the crisp, white envelope. To Mr. Frank Delaney. From Law Offices of Whitman and Keene. He almost threw it away, figured it was a scam. But something stopped him. You are cordially invited to attend a private reception in your honor. He read it twice. 3 times. An address was listed downtown, upscale hotel, ballroom suite. He didn't own a suit anymore. The best he had was a clean flannel and some slacks that didn't quite fit right. Still, curiosity got the better of him. The doorman looked him up and down when he arrived, but said nothing. Inside, the room shimmered. Chandeliers. Music. Dozens of people in dresses and tuxedos. He felt wildly out of place. Then a young woman stepped forward. She had long dark hair, curled at the ends, a scar just under her chin, and the kind of smile that felt like springtime after a hard winter. You came, she whispered. He stared at her, confused. I'm Ella, she said. He nearly dropped his cane. You? But you. She threw her arms around him. You saved my life, Mr. Frank. Tears slid down his cheeks before he could stop them. Ella stepped back, beaming. I was adopted by one of the nurses. I got treatment in another state. It took a long time, but I beat it. I went to college. Medical school. I'm a pediatrician now. Frank's voice cracked. A doctor. She nodded. And tonight, I'm not just honoring you. I'm giving something back. She reached into her purse and pulled out a folded document. It's the deed to a home. In your name. Mortgage paid. Utilities set for life. You'll never work another shift again, Frank. He couldn't speak. I also found out what they did to you, she added. And I've got lawyers helping reinstate your pension. With back pay. The room erupted into applause. Not because they knew the full story, but because Ella had told them one thing that mattered most. This man, she had said, gave everything when no one else would. And now it's our turn. Frank wept openly. For the child he once held stories for the years lost, for the hope returned. And later that night, in the quiet of his new home, he found Captain Bristles sitting on his bed. Ella had kept him all these years. Frank held the bear to his chest and whispered, Mission complete, Captain. The days that followed the reception felt surreal. Frank had never lived in a home like this: clean white walls, a small backyard with a single oak tree, and a kitchen that smelled like sunlight through glass. It wasn't extravagant, but to a man who'd lived most of his life paycheck to paycheck, it felt like a mansion. He didn't have to report anywhere. No time cards to punch. No uniforms to iron. But it was the silence that unnerved him most at first. He had never really known how to rest. The first morning, he woke at 5 a.m. on instinct. Made coffee. Sat on the porch. Watched the sun creep across the lawn. And for the first time in decades, there was no pressure in his chest. No dread about bills or sore knees or the cold face of a boss with no room for mercy. He was free. But freedom, Frank quickly realized, came with an ache of its own, one that rattled deep in his bones. Because now that there was space in his life, all the memories he'd kept buried began to surface again. Memories of long nights walking sterile hallways. Of folding his coat around Ella's shoulders when the hospital thermostat failed. Of eating crackers for dinner so she could have her meds. Of leaving without saying goodbye. That pain didn't leave him. Not fully. One morning, as he sipped his coffee, the doorbell rang. When he opened it, Ella was standing there again. This time, in jeans and a red sweater, holding a paper bag and smiling like a daughter visiting home. I brought breakfast, she said. He stepped aside, unsure of what to say. They sat at the kitchen table, the scent of egg sandwiches warming the air. I don't know how to thank you, Frank said eventually. All this. You already did, Ella replied softly. You thanked me when you gave me your time. when no one else would. Frank looked down. I thought about you. Every day. She nodded. Me too. Then, reaching into her bag, she pulled out a photo album. I thought we could make something together. A book. Of everything that happened. I want to remember the parts that mattered. Frank's throat tightened. The first page had a faded picture of a small hospital room with a teddy bear on the bed. Captain Bristles. The second showed a drawing, a child's crayon scrawl of a tall man in a blue uniform standing guard beside a little girl. I drew that after the night you told me the raccoon story, Ella said. You don't know this, but you were the reason I started to dream again. Frank swallowed hard. They spent hours going through old stories. Ella had written journals during recovery. Frank still remembered dates, places, even the brand of toast she liked, cinnamon raisin, barely browned. Each memory stitched them closer. After lunch, they sat on the back porch. The air smelled like rain. Frank, she said suddenly, I've been thinking. About what? I want to start a foundation. He looked over. In your name, she continued. To support sick children who have no family. Help cover treatments. Build programs that make sure no one falls through the cracks like I almost did. He shook his head, overwhelmed. Ella, I don't want attention. It's not about attention, she said gently. It's about legacy. He didn't answer right away. Finally, he nodded. If it helps the kids, then yes. But call it something simple. Something that reminds people that ordinary folks can still matter. She smiled. The Watchman Fund. He chuckled, surprised. That's what you used to call me. She reached for his hand. Because you watched over me. When no one else did. The weeks passed quickly. Frank met lawyers, signed documents, helped Ella and her team sketch out the beginnings of the nonprofit. He sat in meetings surrounded by people younger than his shoes, but they listened when he spoke. The first fundraiser was a small dinner hosted at a local community center. Frank didn't expect much, maybe a few donations, polite handshakes. But word had spread. The night of the event, the room was packed. Former patients, nurses, families who'd heard about the Watchman Fund through social media, and then news crews. Frank felt awkward in the spotlight, but Ella stood beside him, steadying him. She introduced him with a short speech. This man taught me what love looks like in silence, what sacrifice looks like without applause, what it means to be seen. Applause thundered. Frank stepped up to the microphone, his hands shaking. I'm not used to this, he began, voice low. I spent most of my life walking hallways people forgot, doing a job most folks don't see. And that's okay. But sometimes, the smallest things we do echo longer than we ever expect. He paused, his eyes misting. I didn't save Ella because I thought I'd get something back. I did it because it was right. That's all. The crowd rose to their feet. Over the next year, donations poured in. The Watchman Fund covered medical bills for over 30 children, arranged housing for 4 families, provided grants to hospitals who needed emergency pediatric funding. Frank stayed behind the scenes. He preferred it that way. But he visited each child the fund helped, told them stories, gave them toast if they wanted it, and always brought a stuffed animal. He kept Captain Bristles on his bookshelf. One rainy afternoon, Ella called him. There's someone I want you to meet, she said. Frank met her at the hospital, the same one where room 412 used to be. In the children's ward, a boy sat quietly in bed, maybe 5 years old, pale, thin, eyes too big for his face. This is Mateo, Ella said softly. Abandoned at birth. He's just started chemo. No known relatives. Frank stepped closer, gently. Hi there, Mateo, he said. I used to know a brave girl who looked just like you. The boy looked up, uncertain. Frank reached into his bag and pulled out a stuffed fox. This is Lieutenant Tails. He's very good at sneaking past monsters. Mateo took it silently, holding it close. I'll come back tomorrow, Frank promised. And he did. Every day? For weeks. He told Mateo about brave raccoons and foxes that raced through forests of shadows and never gave up. He sat beside him during treatments, brought toast with cinnamon, even let him name the pigeons outside the window. One day, Mateo reached out, and took Frank's hand without a word. Frank didn't let go. It was happening again. The cycle of kindness, passed down like a story retold. A month later, Mateo's doctors called it a miracle remission had begun. Frank didn't call it a miracle. He called it faith. In the months that followed, more children came. More families were helped. And each time, Frank was there. Not in a lab coat. Not in a boardroom. Just in a worn sweater, with a bag full of toast and toys. One crisp October morning, as the leaves turned gold, Frank stood on the steps of a brand-new pediatric wing built with Watchman Fund donations. His name was etched in stone by the entrance. He turned to Ella. "You sure about this?" he asked. She smiled. "You earned it." He looked up at the words. The Frank Delaney Children's Wing. He laughed quietly. They spelled it right. That's already a miracle. She leaned into his shoulder. "You gave me life, Frank. Let me give you something that lasts." He looked around at the children running past, at the parents crying in hallways, at the doctors and nurses pouring in and out. This was never what he imagined retirement would be, but it was exactly what it needed to be. He whispered something only Ella could hear. "I thought I was invisible." "You were never invisible to the people who mattered," she said. And in that moment, under an October sun and surrounded by a world he helped reshape, Frank finally believed it. That evening, after the dedication ceremony at the new children's wing, Frank returned to his modest house with a warm exhaustion in his chest. The kind that came not from fatigue, but from fulfillment. He sat in his recliner, still the same old one he had dragged with him for years, and stared out the window, the sky glowing orange and purple with twilight. For a while, he thought he might drift off to sleep, but something pulled him back. He got up, walked slowly to the shelf where Captain Bristles sat, and took the bear in his hands. The fur was worn now, one ear slightly loose, but the eyes still held something, some tiny glimmer of the past, of Ella, of room 412 and quiet nights full of whispered fairy tales. Frank turned the bear over and smiled. There, tucked into the seam of its belly, was a tiny white tag. Property of E. Martinez. He hadn't noticed it before. The weight of everything, the years, the heartbreak, the fight, the return pressed on him at once. And for the first time in a long, long while, Frank let himself cry. Not from sorrow. From relief. From release. Later that week, he was invited to speak at a youth center funded by the Watchman Fund. A group of teenagers sat in metal chairs in a circle, waiting for this quiet old man they'd heard stories about. He didn't prepare notes. He just looked around the room and said, "You don't have to be a superhero to change someone's life. You just have to show up. And keep showing up, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard." One of the boys raised a hand. "Weren't you poor your whole life?" Frank chuckled. "Still am, depending on how you count it. But I never measured wealth in dollars." The boy frowned. "Then how?" Frank paused. "In lives. In second chances. In the way a child says your name like it means something." That stuck with them. He could tell. Afterward, several of the teens came up to shake his hand. One even hugged him. A tall, broad-shouldered boy with tears in his eyes said, "My little sister's sick. But hearing your story, I think I'm going to be okay. I think I can be strong for her." Frank nodded, squeezing his shoulder. "Then you already are." The months passed quickly after that. Spring rolled into summer. Mateo finished his last round of treatment and rang the golden bell in the hospital hallway, his tiny fist punching the air with victory. Frank was there, cheering. Ella published a memoir called The Watchman's Hour. It became a bestseller within weeks. Not because it was sensational, but because it was real, quietly powerful. The kind of story people needed in a world so often cold and fast. The proceeds went directly into the fund. Frank never read the book completely, said he didn't need to. "I lived it," he said with a grin. He spent his days doing what he loved best. Walking the halls of the children's wing, sitting with scared parents, bringing cinnamon toast, and telling bedtime tales. He became known as Grandpa Frank to hundreds of kids who had no grandparents of their own. Every Christmas, He dressed as Santella insisted and gave out stuffed animals. He refused to wear the fake beard, though. The real one's better, he joked. But underneath the joy, time was beginning to catch up with him. His walks grew slower. The stairs took longer. Some mornings, he'd forget things where he left his keys, or what day it was. Ella noticed. So did the doctors. They ran tests. The diagnosis came softly. Early onset dementia, likely accelerated by stress and age. Frank took the news quietly, like he always did. No complaints. No fear. He just nodded and said, "Guess I'd better start telling the good stories faster." Ella cried in private, but not in front of him. Instead, she started recording their conversations. Every story he remembered. Every name, every detail. She said it was for the archives, but it was for her. So she'd never lose the sound of his voice, the words that had once saved her life. By the time Frank's memory began to slip significantly, a new mural had been painted on the children's wing wall. It showed a tall man in a blue uniform, standing beneath a tree with a little girl on his shoulders. Around them, children laughed and played. Underneath, in gold letters, "The world is changed by those who care when no one is watching." Frank Delaney. On the day they unveiled the mural, Frank stood quietly before it, hands clasped behind his back. He studied the painting carefully. Then he turned to Ella. "Is that me?" he asked. She smiled, tears sparkling in her eyes. "Yes, Frank. That's you." He stared a moment longer. "Well," he said, his voice tired but proud, "I hope I made him proud." "You did," Ella whispered. Every day, as the sun set behind them, casting a warm glow on the golden letters, Frank took her hand. He may have forgotten many things in the years that followed, the names of places, the time of day, sometimes even his own birthday. But he never forgot Ella. Never forgot the stories. Never forgot the love. And neither did the world. Frank's decline was slow but steady. He began repeating himself in conversations, forgetting faces he'd known for years. Some days, he would sit on the front porch with Captain Bristles in his lap, staring into the trees, murmuring half-finished stories from decades ago. But Ella never left his side. She adjusted her clinic hours so she could visit him daily. On days when he recognized her, he would smile and greet her like a best friend from childhood. On the hard days, he'd just stare at her blankly, as if searching for something in her face that he couldn't quite grasp. But she stayed. She always stayed. One morning in early spring, Frank woke up in a panic. He called out into the hallway of his small home, confused, trembling. "Where am I? Where's the hospital? Where's Ella?" Ella, who had been sleeping in the guest room after a late night writing grant proposals for the fund, rushed to his side. "I'm here," she said, holding his hands. "You're safe, Frank. You're at home." He stared at her, tears in his eyes. "I can't remember your face sometimes." She squeezed his hand gently. "That's okay. I'll remind you. As many times as it takes." He broke down sobbing. "You saved me," he whispered. "No, Frank," she said, brushing back his thinning white hair. "You saved me first." From then on, she recorded a video every morning. A message for Frank to watch whenever he woke up confused. "Hi, Frank. My name is Ella. You helped me once, when I was just a little girl. You stayed by my side when no one else did. Now it's my turn. I love you. You're not alone." Sometimes he watched it 5 times before lunch. And sometimes he cried each time like it was the first. But even as his memory unraveled, something remarkable began to take shape around him. Inspired by Frank's story and Ella's book, donors from across the country, some from around the world, started contributing to the Watchman Fund. Schools added his tale to curriculum modules about compassion. Social workers referenced his example and training. Artists painted murals of a man in a security uniform holding a child's hand, guarding the forgotten, the overlooked. One major hospital named an entire family care unit after him. At the core of it all, Ella remained his bridge to the world. She created an audio archive of Frank's stories, read by children who had survived cancer thanks to the fund. She called it the Watchman's Voice. Each child read one of his old tales, recorded in warm studio lighting, filled with emotion. Frank, even as he faded, would listen to them. Sometimes he cried. Other times he laughed and said, "That raccoon still tricks those wolves, huh?" Ella smiled through her own tears. Every time. Then came the day his legs stopped supporting him. He'd been walking in the hallway when he collapsed. Ella rushed him to the hospital, his old hospital, now transformed. The doctors admitted him to the same floor where room 412 had once stood. Now, the whole floor was called the Frank Delaney Pediatric Hope Unit. Even in a bed, connected to IVs and heart monitors, Frank still told stories. The nurses would gather at night and sit beside him. Children recovering from chemo took turns reading to him, honoring the man who gave them a chance to be alive. He still had good days. One in particular stood out. It was a bright day in June. The flowers outside his window bloomed like a promise. Ella brought a guest. Matteo, now 8 years old, his hair growing back, walked into the room holding a sketch pad. Frank blinked, confused at first. But as the boy approached and offered a small drawing of a fox with a hospital badge, something lit up in Frank's eyes. "Lieutenant Tails," he whispered. Matteo nodded. "You remembered." Frank reached out, his hand trembling. "You kept the story going." Matteo leaned in and hugged him tight. "Always." That night, Frank asked Ella for one last favor. "Promise me," he said, "that when I go you won't stop telling the stories." "I promise," she said, tears streaking her cheeks. He smiled. "And make sure the toast doesn't get too brown. Kids never liked it that way." She laughed and held his hand, and they sat together as the sun dipped behind the hills. 3 days later, he passed away in his sleep. Peacefully, without pain, Captain Bristles by his side. The hospital held a public memorial. They expected maybe 100 guests. Over 4,000 came. Doctors, janitors, social workers, kids he'd helped, kids he never met, all carrying stories of their own. Stories that began or changed because of one quiet security guard who never asked for credit. There was no grand eulogy, just a circle of people sharing memories. One nurse said, "He reminded me why I got into medicine in the first place." A teenager who'd once been homeless said, "When I was scared in the ER, he held my hand, told me I mattered." A child who beat cancer said, "He told me stories about brave animals, and I believed them. I believed I could be brave, too." And finally, Ella stepped up. She was wearing a simple navy dress, a silver watch on her wrist, the one Frank had pawned, restored, and returned by an anonymous donor years later. She stood in front of the crowd, heart full, voice steady. "I've been asked to write books, to give lectures, to speak on podcasts, and I've done all that. But nothing will ever capture what Frank Delaney meant to me, or to the thousands of lives he touched. He didn't save me with money or with grand gestures. He saved me with presence, with kindness, with a piece of toast and a story and a teddy bear named Captain Bristles. And now, it's up to all of us to keep the stories alive." She stepped down to thunderous applause, but her heart was quiet, full of a deeper peace. 2 weeks later, the foundation received a large anonymous donation enough to fund a new research grant for rare childhood cancers. Attached was a note written in pencil. "In honor of the man who stayed when no one else did. The Watchman lives on." In the years that followed, the legacy only grew. The Watchman Fund expanded internationally, opening satellite programs in countries where healthcare access was limited. It built mobile clinics, trained local doctors, and provided mental health support to families. But at the center of every building, in every country, hung a framed photo. Frank Delaney in his security uniform, kneeling beside a young Ella, a crayon drawing in her hands. The caption beneath always read, "He didn't wear a cape, but he never walked away." Ella, now head of the entire foundation, would visit each new site personally. And in every room where a child lay fighting for their life, she would place a small, worn teddy bear on the windowsill. Captain Bristles. The kids didn't always know why it was there, but they'd hold him close, listen to the stories, and somehow, hope would bloom again. Because Frank had taught the world that love isn't measured in what you have. It's measured in what you give, especially when no one is watching. 10 years after Frank's passing, the Watchman Fund had become one of the most respected nonprofit organizations in the world. From emergency pediatric wards in inner-city hospitals to mobile treatment vans in war-torn villages, Frank's legacy was everywhere. His face kind, weathered, always watching adorned murals, classroom walls, even postage stamps in 3 countries. His story had been adapted into a children's book, a documentary, and a major motion picture. But Ella remained the guardian of the real story, the quiet truth beneath the headlines. And for her, that truth never changed. Frank Delaney had been her guardian angel when no one else even noticed she existed. Now, she was doing everything she could to repay that debt forward 1,000-fold. But time has a way of catching up with everyone, even those who've survived the impossible. One chilly November morning, Ella woke up in her apartment overlooking the hospital campus. She was now 41. The streaks of silver in her dark hair had started showing, and the circles under her eyes had grown deeper from years of midnight emergencies and advocacy meetings. Still, she smiled when she saw the weathered photo on her nightstand, the same one from the memorial, young Ella sitting beside Frank, both of them caught mid-laugh. She pressed a kiss to the frame before heading into another day that promised no rest. That morning, she had to review plans for a new children's recovery center to be built in South America. The local partners had finally secured permits. The project would be named the Watchman's Garden, a place for kids to heal after trauma, where hope would bloom beside real trees, not just 4 poles. She also had an interview scheduled with a journalist from Time who was writing a cover story on the legacy of quiet heroes. Ella had done hundreds of interviews over the years, but she always began the same way. "I'm not the hero. Frank was." This time was no different. The journalist, a young woman named Ava, leaned in with her recorder. "How did you first meet Frank Delaney?" Ella smiled, the answer tattooed in her bones. "I was 6. I was dying, and he brought me toast." Ava blinked. "Toast?" Ella nodded. "And stories. And Captain Bristles. But mostly he brought presents. No judgment. No pity. Just presents." The interview lasted over an hour, and when it ended, Ava asked to see the bear. Captain Bristles still lived on Ella's office bookshelf, now carefully preserved in a glass case, but always visible to the children who visited. "He's older than most of my patients," Ella joked, "but I think he still believes in happy endings." Later that evening, Ella returned to room 412, or at least the rebuilt version of it. In honor of Frank, the room had been reconstructed exactly as it had once been. White walls, a small bed, soft yellow lighting, and the scent of warm toast piped in from the staff kitchen. It was never occupied for medical reasons. It was used only for one thing: storytime. Every night, a volunteer or former patient came to room 412 to read stories aloud. No cameras, no stage, just a voice, a bear, and a child or two who needed to feel safe. On this night, it was Ella's turn. She took the armchair near the bed, pulled out an old worn copy of The Brave Raccoon and the Wolf Forest, and opened to the first page. In walked 2 children siblings, no older than 5 and 7. Their mother had died in a car crash 3 weeks earlier. Their father was in critical care. They looked hollowed out by life. Ella welcomed them with a smile, patting the edge of the bed. "Want to hear a good story?" They nodded shyly. And so she read, her voice warm, slow, soft. When she finished, the younger sibling asked, "Did the raccoon really beat all the wolves?" Ella nodded. "Every single one. Because he never gave up. And because someone believed in him." The child reached out toward Captain Bristles. "Can I hold him?" Ella hesitated, then opened the glass case. "You can hold him," she said, gently placing the bear in the child's arms. but only if you promise to give him back when the next kid needs him. The child smiled for the first time since entering the room. Promise. As the children drifted to sleep on the bed, their breathing slow and peaceful, Ella sat back in the chair. And for a moment, she swore she could hear Frank's voice beside her. Good job, kid. She didn't open her eyes. Thanks, Frank, she whispered into the quiet. Over the following year, a strange series of letters began arriving at the Watchman Foundation's headquarters. No return address. Always typewritten. Always signed the same way. Another watchman. Each letter included a donation, sometimes small, sometimes enormous. But each one also contained a story. A security guard in a Texas hospital who gave up his lunch break to play cards with a lonely elderly patient. A janitor in Vermont who taught a child chess in between chemo sessions. A cafeteria worker in Singapore who slipped extra fruit into the lunch trays of foster kids. Dozens, then hundreds. Ella created a wall in the main office titled The Watchman Among Us. She had no idea who was behind the letters, but she knew Frank would have loved it. It was proof that kindness ripples. That love real, ordinary, daily love multiplies in silence. On the 10th anniversary of Frank's passing, a statue was unveiled in front of the hospital. It showed Frank standing with his coat open, one arm extended as if shielding something from harm. In his other hand, he held Captain Bristles. Around his feet, etched into the base, were the names of every child the fund had helped to date. Over 11,000. Ella stood beside the statue, now in her early 40s, her own adopted daughter holding her hand. The little girl had leukemia once. Now she danced in the grass with a plastic stethoscope around her neck and a fox plush toy clutched in her arms. A reporter approached Ella after the unveiling. "Do you think Frank ever imagined all of this?" he asked. Ella looked up at the statue, sunlight dancing across its bronze face. "No," she said. "He never imagined it. But he made it possible." That night, Ella returned home and found an envelope in her mailbox. No return address. Inside, a note. "In a world where people chase spotlights, you taught us to follow quiet footsteps. We remember. We carry it forward. Another watchman." She smiled, folded the note carefully, and placed it into a wooden box labeled Letters to Frank. It was nearly full. She lit a candle by the window, just like Frank used to during his late shifts. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees. She swore, for a second, she could hear footsteps on the porch. But when she opened the door, no one was there. Only the night. Only the stars. Only the deep, steady beat of a life well lived echoing across the years. Ella whispered into the darkness, voice trembling with both ache and peace. "You're still watching, aren't you?" And somewhere, perhaps in the space between the living and the remembered, Frank Delaney smiled. Mission still ongoing. Stories still being told. Hope forever standing guard.